What would you do if the only roof you could afford in the whole wide territory cost you $3 and came with a warning nailed to the door? At 19, with everything she owned rattling in the back of a sway-backed wagon, Rose Cooper handed over 3 coins to a county clerk and walked out holding the deed to a condemned hunting lodge above Briar Hollow, a place folks in the valley crossed the road to avoid speaking of. But what she would find behind its bolted lower door would shake the whole valley down to its foundation stones. Settle in, pull your chair close to the lamp, and let us know where you're listening from tonight. Because this story is one you'll want to hear all the way through. The road into Briar Hollow was a pale scar cut between 2 ridges of pine, and Rose came down it on foot beside the mare because the wagon wheel had gone soft 2 miles back. Dust the color of old flour lay on her boots and the hem of her skirt. She had not eaten since the morning before, and she had not slept indoors in 11 weeks. Her father had been dead 6 months. Her stepmother had sold the homestead out from under her the same week they lowered him into the ground, and there had been no paper Rose could sign, no word she could say, that made the sheriff look up from his ledger. She was 19. She had a mare named June, a canvas satchel of clothes, her mother's Bible, a folding knife, and 37 cents. The town crouched at the bottom of the grade, like something waiting to be told to move. A saloon leaned into a livery. A church with a bell no bigger than a milk pail stood at the far end, next to a graveyard bounded by chicken wire. Smoke lifted straight up from 3 chimneys in the still air. It was late September, and the light had that thin amber weight that meant the year was tired. Rose tied June to the rail outside the general store and stood a long moment before she went in. She had learned, in her weeks on the road, that a girl alone drew a certain kind of look, and that the best answer to it was to keep her eyes level and her voice low. Inside, a woman behind the counter looked her up and down without warmth and asked what she wanted. "Work," Rose said. "None here." "A room, then. Cheap." The woman almost laughed. "Cheap don't exist, child." Rose thanked her and stepped back out into the sun. She stood on the plank walk with her hand on June's neck and felt, for the first time since the burial, something close to giving up. Down the street, a small tin plate above a door read, "County Clerk." She had no reason to walk toward it. She walked toward it anyway. The clerk was a spare, kind-eyed man in a paper collar who looked up when the bell rang and did not look away when he saw her face. He gestured to the chair across his desk. She sat. She told him, in the shortest sentences she could manage, what had happened to her. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet a moment, tapping his pen against the blotter. Then he opened a lower drawer, drew out a thin folder, and set it between them. "There is one thing," he said. "Nobody will touch it." Rose looked at the folder and did not answer. He turned it so she could read the top page. It was a deed of tax sale for a hunting lodge on the ridge above the hollow, 40 acres, condemned by the county 3 winters running for structural failure and, in smaller print underneath, for cause. The minimum bid was $3. $3? Rose said. $3? The clerk did not smile. "It has sat on this desk almost 4 years. No one will meet the price." "Why?" He hesitated. He seemed to weigh 2 answers and choose the lesser. "Folks say the place is cursed. A man died there. Others say more than one. The county wants it off the books. That is all I can tell you honest." Rose looked at the deed a long time. She thought of June, hollow-flanked in the street. She thought of the first frost, which was coming. She thought of her father, who had once told her that a roof of any kind was the beginning of every plan a person ever made. She reached into her coat and set 3 coins on the blotter. They rang once and lay still. The clerk looked at them. Then he looked at her. "Miss Cooper," he said, quiet. "You are sure?" "I am sure." He inked the transfer without another word, blotted it, folded it, and slid it across to her. As she stood to go, he added, almost against his own will, "There is a door in the lower part of that house, padlocked. The county never opened it. I would leave it be if I were you." Rose folded the deed into her satchel and stepped out onto the plank walk. 3 men outside the saloon had watched her go in and were watching her come out, and one of them, a big man in a fine gray coat, laughed loud enough for the street to hear. $3 for a dead man's house," he called. "You bought yourself a grave, girl." She did not answer him. She untied June and led her toward the road out of town. "Would you have set those 3 coins down on that blotter? Would you have believed a cursed lodge was better than another night under a wagon? And what do you think waits behind a door the county itself was afraid to open? If this story has already caught you, leave a comment below. Tell us where you're listening from, and subscribe so you don't miss what Rose Cooper found when she finally climbed that ridge. Because what she uncovered inside those walls would rewrite everything Briar Hollow thought it knew about itself. The laugh followed her past the livery and did not stop when she turned the corner. It never does in a town that small. A laugh in Briar Hollow was a coin passed from one hand to the next, and by the time Rose reached the water trough at the north end of the street, 3 women on the church steps had already caught it and were holding it between them like something warm. "That is the Cooper girl," one of them murmured, not quietly enough. "Bought the Ridge house. $3. $3 and a hole in the ground," said another. "Poor thing does not know." Rose kept her eyes on June's shoulder and her hand on the lead. June's ears flicked once at the voices and settled again. A horse learns early which sounds belong to weather and which to people, and June had long since decided people were the lesser storm. The big man in the fine gray coat had followed as far as the end of the plank walk. He stood there now with his thumbs in his belt, watching her go, and the 2 men behind him were watching too, though with less pleasure. He wore a silver watch chain across his vest, and his boots had never been used for walking. Rose did not know his name yet. She would learn it soon enough. In Briar Hollow, a man like Boyd Merrick did not stay unnamed long. "Girl," he called after her, "you come back down when the snow starts. We will put you up in the livery loft for a fair price." One of his men laughed. The other did not. Rose walked on. At the last building on the north side of the road, an old woman was sitting on a low stool in a strip of sun, snapping the ends off a lapful of beans. Her hands were brown and knotted as pine roots, and her eyes, when they lifted, were the pale watercolor of a sky washed thin by winter. She wore a black shawl pinned with a bone brooch. She watched Rose pass, and Rose, without meaning to, slowed. "You are the one?" the old woman said. Her voice was low and even without surprise. "Ma'am." "You are going up the ridge." "I am." The old woman set a bean down carefully on the pile in her apron and did not move her eyes from Rose's face. "That house has been waiting on a small hand," she said. "Do not be afraid of what was locked. Be afraid of who did the locking." Rose stood a moment in the road, with the words settling on her like dust. She did not understand them. She did not ask. Something in the old woman's face told her that asking would not open the meaning any further, and that the meaning would open on its own when it was ready. "Thank you," Rose said. "Go on, child. The light is turning." Rose went on. When she looked back once at the bend where the road began to climb, The old woman was bent again over her beans, as if nothing had passed between them at all. The road out of Briar Hollow rose gently at first, through cut hayfields gone gold and stubbled, then more steeply into a country of red cedar and split rock. June labored a little at the grade, and Rose walked beside her rather than ride, because the wagon was somewhere behind them yet, and June had carried enough. The soft wheel would have to wait until morning. A neighbor 2 miles back had promised to keep an eye on the wagon in exchange for a day of Rose's work when she came for it, and Rose meant to honor that promise before she honored any other. Behind her, the town shrank. Ahead, the ridge stood dark against a paling sky, and somewhere up there, hidden in a fold of pine, was a roof she owned. The climb took the better part of 2 hours. The road narrowed to a track, then to a suggestion of a track. 2 wagon ruts filled with cedar needles, a fallen limb no one had bothered to drag aside in 3 seasons. Rose stepped over it and led June around. The air grew colder as they rose. It smelled of pitch and wet stone and something older underneath, a mineral cold that comes off north-facing rock in the last week of September and does not lift again until spring. She saw the lodge before she was ready to see it. It stood in a small clearing where the ridge flattened, its long, low shape half swallowed by the pines that had grown up close against its western wall. The roof sagged in the middle like the spine of a tired horse. One of the front shutters hung by a single hinge and turned slowly in a breath of wind. The chimney was sound, at least, squared river stone, laid by a hand that had known its work. But the porch boards were black with rot at the edges, and the door itself had warped in its frame so that a wedge of evening light showed between it and the jamb. Rose stood at the edge of the clearing a long moment and looked at what $3 silver had bought her. "Well," she said, to no one in particular. June blew a breath against her sleeve. The light was already going. The sun had dropped behind the higher ridge to the west, and the clearing sat in that blue hush that comes before true dusk, when the world seems to hold still and listen to itself. Rose led June around to the lee of the building, out of the wind, and loosened her cinch and rubbed her down with a handful of dry grass. There was a lean-to at the back of the lodge, roof half caved, but the standing half was enough to shelter a horse from a night's dew. Rose tied June there, loose enough that she could lie down, and left her a double handful of the oats she had been saving in a twist of paper at the bottom of her satchel. She did not try the door of the lodge that night. Something in her, some quiet, held-back thing her father had taught her without ever naming it, said the house should be entered by daylight, and only after she had heard it in the dark. She spread her blanket on the porch boards, up against the front wall where the overhang was still whole, and she sat with her back to the logs and her knees drawn up and her mother's Bible unopened in her lap. She did not read. She listened. The pines ticked as the sap cooled in them. Somewhere below in the valley an owl called twice and then a third time, farther off. From inside the lodge, once, there came a small sound, a settling, a shift of weight in old wood, and then nothing. Rose did not sleep for a long while. When she did, she dreamed of a door she could not see, and a hand on the other side of it, waiting. She woke to the flat, gray light that comes an hour before sunrise on the north side of a ridge, when the frost has not yet lifted from the bracken and the air tastes of iron. Her breath stood in front of her. June was already up in the lean-to, ears forward, watching the lodge with the patient attention of an animal that had decided to trust the person who fed her, but had not yet decided to trust the place. Rose folded her blanket, tucked the Bible back into her satchel, and stood a long moment on the porch, listening to the house in daylight the way she had listened to it in the dark. The door gave with the flat of her shoulder, not locked, only swollen in its frame. It opened onto a single long room that ran the depth of the lodge, with a stone hearth on the western wall, a plank table shoved crooked against the eastern one, and a ladder in the far corner going up to a loft she could not yet see into. Dust hung in the light from the shutterless window. A tin cup sat on the table with the ring of its last coffee still dried inside it. Whoever had left this house had left it in the middle of a thought. Rose walked the floor slowly, foot by foot, testing the boards. Most held. Too near the hearth gave a soft complaint under her weight, but did not sink. She noted them and moved on. She was not looking for anything yet. She was letting the house show her what it wanted her to see first. What it showed her was the beam. The main ridgepole of the ceiling ran the length of the room from the hearth wall to the far wall, and it was sound old oak, adzed square, dark with smoke from years of cook fires. But halfway down its length, above the plank table, a second beam had been laid across it at a right angle and pegged in. That crosspiece did not carry any weight. Nothing rested on it. Nothing hung from it. It served no purpose Rose could name. She stood under it and turned her head slowly, and could not make it into a rafter or a brace or a support for a loft that had never been built. It was simply there, out of place, in a house whose every other timber had a reason. She stepped up onto the plank table to see the crosspiece closer. The underside of it had been carved, not deeply, not showily. A single line of small letters cut clean into the grain with the point of a knife, in a hand steady enough that whoever had done it had taken his time. Rose read it once and then read it again to be certain of the letters, because they made no name she knew. For the ones below. She stood on the table in the cold room with her fingertips against the wood and the words above her, and she did not move for a long count. Below. There was a below. The clerk had said there was. A padlocked door in the lower part of the house, he had said, and he had said to leave it alone. Rose stepped down from the table carefully and set the tin cup upright where it had been, and she went out into the clearing to see to June before she let herself think any further. Because her father had taught her that a mind fed on an empty stomach would run in the wrong direction every time. She did not go looking for the lower door that morning. She had heard the house in the dark, and she had let it show her one thing in the light, and one thing was enough for one day. Instead, she began to work. That was the only answer she knew to a question too big to hold. She took stock first. She counted what the lodge had and what it did not. It had 4 walls of squared pine standing plumb enough. It had a stone chimney that a bird had not yet nested in. It had a hearth with a cast iron crane still bolted into the mortar, and a swing hook on the crane that would hold a kettle. It had a plank table and a 3-legged stool and a wooden bucket with 2 staves gone. It did not have a window that closed, or a door that latched, or a mattress, or a stove, or a single stick of split wood inside its walls. Rose walked the clearing and gathered what she could. Deadfall from the pines at the edge of the flat, dry enough to burn by afternoon. Flat stones from the slope below the porch to shore up the porch boards that had rotted at the corners. A length of good cedar shake from the collapsed half of the lean-to, which she carried around and leaned against the front wall to patch the roof where it sagged worst. June watched her from the standing half of the lean-to, and once, when Rose passed close with an armload of shakes, put her muzzle against Rose's shoulder and left it there for the length of a breath before Rose moved on. She worked through the morning and into the noon hour without eating. She had nothing to eat. At midday, she found a thin creek 200 paces below the lodge where the ridge broke into a run of mossy stone, and she drank from her cupped hands and washed the dust of the road from her face and her forearms, and she carried water back to June in the tin cup. 6 trips, until June had drunk her fill. Then Rose sat on the porch step with her boots off and picked cedar splinters from her palms with the point of her folding knife. That afternoon, she found the second thing. She had gone around to the west wall to see how badly the pines had grown into it, and where the trees pressed closest against the logs. At knee-height, someone had cut a small notch into the third log from the bottom and driven a square-headed iron nail into the notch, so that the nail head sat flush with the wood. It was not a nail that held anything. It was a mark. She ran her thumb across it, and the iron was cold and unrusted at the tip, as though it had lived its life inside the wood and only recently been touched by weather. She stepped back and looked along the wall, and 10 paces further, at the same knee-height, in the same clean notch, there was a second nail. She counted 4 before the wall ended at the corner. Rose did not say anything aloud. She only stood at the west corner of the lodge with her hand on the last nail and looked back the way she had come, along the line of small iron heads set into the logs at a height a child could touch. And she understood, in the wordless way hands understand a thing before the mind catches up, that whoever had built this house had built it to be found by someone who knew how to look. Rose walked the nail line twice more before the light began to go. 4 heads, evenly spaced, set at the height where a small hand would find them by sweeping the wall. She thought of the old woman on the stool and the words she had chosen, small hand, and she felt the shape of them settle against the shape of the iron under her thumb. That night, she did not sleep on the porch. She spread her blanket inside on the plank floor near the cold hearth and set her folding knife open beside her hand. And she listened to the lodge as she had listened the first night. The small settling of old wood, and something else now, a hollowness beneath the sound, as though the room itself sat on top of a bell. At first light, she took the 3-legged stool and the tin cup and the point of her knife and went to the corner where the 2 boards had complained under her weight the day before. She lifted the edge of the first plank with the knife until she could get her fingers beneath it, and the plank came up as if it had been waiting to be lifted. There were no nails in it. The board beside it lifted the same way. Beneath both boards was a square of packed clay floor, and set into the clay was a hatch of pine planks bound by 2 iron straps, and set into the hatch was a padlock the size of Rose's fist. The padlock was newer than anything else in the lodge. Its shackle was oiled. Its keyhole faced the ceiling. Rose sat back on her heels. She did not have the key. She thought briefly of going down to Briar Hollow for a smith, and then she thought of Boyd Merrick's coat and his boots that had never been used for walking, and she did not go. She worked the hasp instead. The hasp was iron and old and set into wood that was not old, and she saw that the wood around the screws was soft with damp. She fetched the crane hook from the hearth, bent the tip against a stone until it made a claw, and worked the claw under the plate of the hasp. The screws came up one at a time with a small dry sound like a tooth. The lock stayed shut and the hasp came away in her hand. Rose lifted the hatch. Cold air came up out of the ground, and with the cold air came a smell of paper and iron and something older, like a cellar in a house long empty. Below her was a set of steps cut from squared timbers going down into a room she could not yet see. She fetched a pine knot from the deadfall, split its end, and lit it at flint against the back of her knife. She went down. The room was small. 4 log walls, a clay floor, no window. On the far wall, a shelf held 5 tin boxes, evenly spaced, and beside them a ledger bound in brown cloth. On the floor beneath the shelf sat a strong box with its lid raised. Rose lifted the lid of the first tin. Inside were letters, folded and tied with cord, addressed in a careful hand to names she did not know, none of them ever sent. The second tin held a child's shoe, single brown leather, worn at the toe. The third held a lock of pale hair tied with black thread. The fourth held a small ambrotype of a woman holding a boy of perhaps 6. The fifth held a bill of sale for 40 acres on the ridge above Briar Hollow, signed in a hand Rose had seen that morning on a plank walk, in the loop of a B and the downstroke of an M. She held the pine knot closer. Boyd Merrick. Rose opened the ledger. The first page bore a heading in the same careful hand as the letters, for the ones below, that they be remembered. Below it were names, dates, and a column of small marks Rose did not yet understand. She counted 11 names before the light of the pine knot began to shake in her fingers, and she understood then what the crosspiece above the plank table had been telling her, and she understood also why the county had kept its distance, and why a man in a fine gray coat had wanted a $3 deed to stay unbought. She stayed in the cellar a long time. She read the letters one by one, sitting on the bottom step with the pine knot wedged in the clay. She learned that a man named Hollis had built the lodge, had kept the ledger, had written to families in 3 counties trying to tell them where their people had gone, and had died before any letter was posted. She learned from the last page of the ledger, in a different hand and a hurried one, that Hollis had not died of the cold. She wrapped the ledger in her shawl and climbed back up into the lodge with it against her chest. And she stood in the long room with the crosspiece above her and did not sit down for some time. That evening the wind changed. It came out of the north early, colder than it had any right to be in the last week of September, and it carried the sound of horses. Rose set the ledger inside the hatch, laid the boards back over the hatch, and stepped onto the porch. 3 riders were coming up the ridge road at a walk. The lead horse was gray. The lead rider wore a coat the color of gray as well, and even at that distance Rose saw the flash of a silver chain across his vest. Rose untied June from the lean-to and led her around behind the lodge into the pines. She pressed her palm flat against June's shoulder, and June stood as still as stone. Rose came back around the front, sat on the porch step with her hands empty in her lap, and waited. Boyd Merrick reined in at the edge of the flat. The 2 men behind him were the same 2 who had stood behind him on the plank walk. The one who had laughed was smiling now. The one who had not laughed had a rifle across his saddle bow and was looking at the door of the lodge. "Cooper girl," Boyd Merrick said. "Mr. Merrick," said Rose. "Cold up here?" he said. "Colder soon." "It is," said Rose. He swung down. His boots met the ground with the softness of leather that had never met ground before. He looked at the roof, at the chimney, at the porch. He did not look at Rose. "I will give you $30 for the deed," he said. "No, thank you," said Rose. 50. "No, thank you." The man with the rifle shifted his weight. Boyd Merrick raised one hand, palm out, without looking at him, and the man went still. Boyd Merrick's eyes came at last to Rose's face. "There is nothing in that house worth your winter, girl," he said. "There are 11 names," said Rose. The silence after that was the largest sound Rose had ever heard. Boyd Merrick's mouth did not move for the count of 3. Then he mounted. He did not speak again. He turned his gray horse and led his 2 men back down the ridge road at a walk that was not quite a walk, and at the last bend before the pines closed on them, the man with the rifle looked back once, and Rose did not move from the porch step until the sound of the hooves was gone from the ridge and only the wind remained, colder now, and turning. Rose did not sleep that night either. She sat with her back to the hearthstones and the ledger in her lap and the folding knife open beside her, and she listened to the ridge. The wind kept turning. Twice she thought she heard hooves, and both times it was only a branch dragging against the shutterless window. Before first light, she wrote out 4 names from the ledger onto a torn flyleaf of her mother's Bible, folded the paper into her satchel, laid the ledger back inside the hatch, and covered the hatch with the boards and the 3-legged stool. Then she bridled June and started down the ridge at a walk in the blue hour. She did not go to the saloon or the general store. She went to the county clerk's office and waited on the plank step until the clerk arrived with his key. He looked at her boots and her face and said nothing until he had the door open and the shutters back. Rose set the flyleaf on his desk and said, "There are 11. This is 4. The clerk read the names. His paper collar was fresh and his hands were not steady when he set the paper down. He asked her, quietly, if there was more. Rose said there was a ledger and a shelf of tin boxes and a bill of sale in the hand of Boyd Merrick. The clerk sat down in his chair before his knees decided for him. He said the circuit judge was 2 days out and would come. He said a marshal rode with him this season. He said Rose was not to sleep in the lodge alone another night, and Rose said she would, because June was there, and the ledger was there, and the ones below had waited long enough for someone to sit above them in the dark. The clerk did not argue. He wrote 3 letters at his desk while she stood, sealed them with a candle stub, and gave one to a boy at the livery to ride north before the sun cleared the ridge. By noon the whisper had crossed Briar Hollow twice. The 3 women on the church steps did not speak when Rose passed with a sack of cornmeal and a paper of salt pork, bought on the clerk's credit against the county's account. Boyd Merrick was not on the plank walk. His gray horse was not at the rail. The saloon door stayed shut through the middle of the day. The judge came on the 3rd morning with the marshal beside him and 2 deputies behind, and the clerk rode up the ridge road with them, and Rose met them on the porch with the hatch already open and the pine knot already lit. The judge was an old spare man with white side whiskers and a soft voice. He went down the steps himself and stayed below a long time. When he came up, his eyes were wet and he did not try to hide it. He set his hand on the crosspiece above the plank table and read the carved line aloud once, for the ones below, and then he took off his hat and stood a while. He said to Rose plainly, "You have done what the law would not." He said the ledger was evidence and the bill of sale was evidence, and that families in 3 counties would be written to before the week was out. He asked her permission to carry the tin boxes down. Rose gave it, and asked that they be brought back when the writing was done, because the ones below were not to be scattered again. The judge said they would be brought back. Boyd Merrick was taken quietly from a room above the saloon at dusk on the 4th day. He did not run and did not speak. He looked once up the ridge road as they walked him to the wagon, and then not again. The man with the rifle rode out of the valley in the night, and was not seen after. The man who had laughed sat in the jail and wept, and told the marshal every place a shovel had gone. The valley came up the ridge in 1s and 2s through the 2nd week of October. A woman from 2 counties north walked the last 2 miles because she had no horse, and she knelt on the clay floor of the cellar with the child's brown shoe in her hands, and did not stand for a long while. A man with a gray beard rode in from the east, and set his palm on the ambrotype, and said the name of the woman in it, which was his sister, and the name of the boy, which was his own. Each of them, before leaving, stopped on the porch and took Rose's hand in both of theirs and said thank you in a voice worn thin from carrying the not knowing. The old woman from the last building on the north side of the road came up the ridge on a borrowed mule with a pot of beans in a cloth on her lap. She set the pot on the hearth crane, hung the swing hook through the bale, and said to Rose, "You were not afraid of the locking." Rose said, "I was. I did it anyway." The old woman nodded and stayed for supper, and the three women from the church steps came the following morning, with a mattress tick stuffed with fresh straw and a pane of glass wrapped in flannel for the window that had not closed. None of them spoke of what they had said before. Rose did not ask them to. The circuit judge returned at the end of October with a folded paper and set it on the plank table under the crosspiece. It named the 40 acres and the lodge as a place of memory, held in Rose's keeping, and it named her by her full name, Miss Rose Cooper, in a clerk's careful hand. The clerk stood at the door with his hat in his hands and said quietly, "Miss Cooper." Rose thanked him. He said the county owed her more than $3. Rose said the county owed the 11, and she would keep the books for them until the last name was answered. On the last still evening of that October, Rose stood on the porch at golden hour with June cropping frost-bitten grass at the edge of the flat and the light coming long and copper through the pines. The chimney was drawing clean, the window held glass. The hatch below her boots was quiet and would stay quiet. She thought of her father saying a roof was the beginning of every plan a person ever made, and she understood at last what he had meant and what he had not known to mean. She said aloud, to no one and to all of them, "I did not buy a house. I found a place that was waiting to be remembered." June lifted her head at the sound of Rose's voice, and the ridge held the light a moment longer, and then let it go. Thank you for staying to the end of this one, for walking the ridge with Rose and June through the cold turning of the year. This was a story about the courage to open what others locked and the quiet weight of remembering. If it moved you, leave a like. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe so you don't miss the next tale from the valley. Rest easy. Another story is already gathering at the edge of the pines.